The following video features excerpts from 6 recorded live lessons on watercolor painting. To learn how you can access weekly live lessons like this, visit thevirtualinstructor.com/members. Over it or anything. And as I mentioned before, this is in 2-point perspective, and really most of the things that you see in reality are going to be in 2-point perspective. Technically it's probably a 3-point perspective, but if you're going to draw it, you probably want to focus in on 2-point perspective. This means that we're going to have a horizon line right across the middle, and I went ahead and kind of marked that with a little bit of a dotted line on each one of the edges. And this means that we're going to have a corner right in the center from which things are going to break away from that corner. Our lines of perspective are going to break away from that corner. So if you'll see that corner right there on that pillar, that's a pretty dominant corner. Of course, this top part of the wall continues just a little further down up here. And then actually in the painting, I'm going to want to let this part down here fade away. We might have a little bit of an indication of the tree that's happening here. Just kind of making some looser marks here to kind of create the edge, the outer edge of this plant that's on the top. And it's important to kind of get a good idea of where the shape of this plant is and what it is, and kind of where the darker spots are going to be and where the lighter spots are going to be. Because you see this plant that comes down over the top of this pillar. We want to make sure that we don't get too dark right there. We want to make sure that we at least bring the color down in that location. So it's a good idea to get a pretty good shape on here at least. All right, maybe we'll erase a few of these lines. We don't want really any of the perspective lines to be seen through the watercolor applications. If some of these other lines show through, it's not a big deal, but maybe we don't want these lines of perspective. So I'm going to start with a real, not necessarily a really solid wash, but enough pigment in there that we're going to get a good wash. And you may want to wet the paper first with water if you want. Sometimes I'll do that. And sometimes I'll just get the color and then go back to the water and just get a little bit of water on my brush. And then I'm just going to quickly kind of make some brush strokes up here. And maybe we'll let that kind of fall down into the tree line a little bit. What I mean by throwing some color on there, I mean getting creative with your colors. Just really, you can get as creative as you want, as long as the values are fairly accurate. Your idea is going to come across, and the subject's going to come across nicely. We'll pull this back out. I'm going to grab that cobalt blue, and then I'm going to add just a touch of burnt umber here. And when we mix those two, we kind of get a dark gray. You know, if we keep mixing them, we'll get a black. But I want that dark gray to have a cooler undertone, so I'm going to make sure there's a little bit of more of the cobalt blue in that mixture. And that's a pretty good color to start with, because we're going to be we'll be careful in all of those areas. Now, I'm not necessarily going to hit the edge of the pergola here, just kind of the shadowed areas initially. And of course we can move the color around while the paint is wet. Alright, so yeah, you can just kind of dab the paintbrush and it will kind of make some positive shapes kind of just pop out there. And again, just kind of putting in some dark spaces and allowing those shapes of darker values to kind of sit there as well. All right, so now we can go back over the top of some of these blue areas with that brown mixture, and hopefully it'll look like it's in shadow. Well, maybe we can even carve out some impression of maybe a few beams under there. And hopefully that will create enough contrast, maybe a little bit more of the ultramarine. There we go. I like that a lot better. Have some more of it. And there are going to be variations that happen in the color, and that's encouraged. Just make your painting a little bit more interesting and make the color feel a little bit more natural. So again, and as we apply it, hopefully these blue undertones will show through. And we'll go back and add some more blue, of course. We're not finished, for sure. And these are far from darker values. Kind of a nice bin tone. Take just a little bit more of the sap green, and I have a little bit of a cleaner spot here. And I'm getting a pretty heavy amount right there. And there's just a little bit of that ultramarine right there. I'm going to let that mix in just a little bit. And we'll go ahead and put that little strip of green back there before we start developing some of the darker areas around it. And that's definitely a little too strong. So a little bit of water, tone it down. But it is kind of bright. The light's getting over there. Change the direction a little bit. Have the brush strokes. Now we've got a big tree that's coming up right here that the trunk's going to come up, and we'll just paint right over the top of what we're putting down right now when we add that. I do want there still to be a couple of breaks in the tree, so I'm not going to cover this variety of greens that I'm applying here everywhere. I'm still going to leave some of these open spaces. Now right in here, there's a bit of that strong green that's getting through. Now another thing about pan watercolors compared to the tube watercolors is, you know, when you're painting on location, you can't beat these cake watercolors clearly. I know that might be an obvious thing, but it's also important to note that that's definitely an advantage. All right, we've got a little bit of plant life that comes down here. I might embellish back here in the shadow a little bit and kind of create maybe a little bit of indication of maybe several different trunks or some things that happen back there in the distance that we're really not sure what they are. Might be a little bit bluer in some areas and maybe a little bit browner in some areas, but you know, in the natural world, that's kind of how we'd see the shadow anyway. We'd see some variety in there. With it. But then it starts to get a little bit lighter as it dries, as you work it on the surface. And you can imagine if you tried to paint these trees exactly the way they are in the photo reference with watercolor, you would lose your mind. You have to let the watercolor kind of move around on the surface and just kind of let each layer of color that you put on there kind of do the work for you. Boy, I'm really itching to put that tree trunk in there. I can't wait to do that. And let's think about where we want it to come up from. And of course, I'm not using very much water here. And then we're going to lose it here for a second. Maybe I'll lose it again. Maybe we'll have a piece come off here. And of course, just kind of borrowing ideas from the reference. All right, now while that paint's still wet, I'm going to grab the card and just scrape off a little bit of the indication of some light hitting the tree trunk here. So right down the side here. And there's more branches that we need to add, but while this is still wet, hopefully I got it in time. Maybe we're a little late on it. And we'll just kind of go back and clean that up. A few indications of some trunks here with this darker color. And if that seems to be too strong, I may go back and darken up that whole area a little bit. We'll let that dry and have a look at it. This whole area down here needs to be a little bit darker though, so we're going to go ahead and start darkening up this. And you can just kind of let your marks kind of move around back there and create all different types of patterns if you want them to, Kind of create some more indications of some trees. I'm actually just taking this color right here and mixing it in with our kind of ultramarine alizarin dance that's happening there on the surface or on the palette. And then we're going to go right on top and just in a couple areas make the value just a little bit darker. And of course we're doing this with a little bit more of a controlled approach. I'm not using the small brush, although I might grab it in a minute. It's a good philosophy, I would say. Of course, you decide what works best for you as an artist, and if you find something that works, then don't listen to anybody else that tells you anything different. But that's kind of harsh advice, I guess. But I always like to try to work with the largest brush for the longest period of time, and then before switching to a smaller brush. This whole thing, there's some darker areas on here, so I don't want to get too dark up there, but actually that's translating okay in the painting. Just put a little bit of water there, let it thin out just a bit. And then right down the side here, gets a little bit darker down towards the bottom. Right, let's grab a little bit of that shadow again, that shadow color, and then we'll bring it over here on the wall that's a little closer. Seemed a little too strong for me, so I've got a little bit of water in the brush just to kind of tone it down a little bit. A little bit of alizarin crimson here just to create a little bit of a reddish tone, and yeah, that'll look a little different as well. Maybe we'll just touch a couple areas down there. Yeah, we don't want it to dominate too much, but a little bit of difference there is important. So let's zoom out and kind of take a look at how that's translating. Go back into these bricks. Now, of course, you can always just swipe color right over the top, and you don't have to necessarily do each individual brick. So let's make sense of these bricks here before we begin. But I think it's kind of a nice touch to just have at least an indication of the individual bricks. Of course, you don't have to do it this way. So I can just pull that color out all the way to the end, just making that entire area a little bit more in shadow. And you can kind of see how natural that shadow feels, even though it's not completely dry yet. It feels pretty natural to me there. And we've got that, this is appearing, it looks like it's white on the feed, but it's actually a really, really light yellow ochre that we used there. So it's kind of got that orangey tint to it, and then we've got the blue shadow. Let's go ahead and put a little bit of that shadow color here on this part of the wall too. Right over the top. We need a little bit more paint there. There we go. So I'm just kind of pulling out elements that I see from the photo reference, anything that looks interesting. And if it doesn't really make sense for what I've got in the painting, then I'm leaving it out. So of course I'm adding a few bits here and there too. Just so we've kind of got a different color there. Slightly different color. Let's take our sap green mixture here. And you can see the warmth of the yellow ochre. And since our applications of the ultramarine and burnt umber mixture are still a little wet, we're going to have some mixing that happens and maybe some bleeding, and that's actually good here. Some people are going to love it, some people are not going to love it so much. All right, and so in some areas I'm getting kind of a heavier pigmented application, so there's less water. I'm just making a few marks here and there, just to add a little bit. And just let that kind of work right over the top of that yellow ochre, that light yellow ochre application. Here we go. In fact, and I'm not even, you know, I've got an idea of where I want these trees to be, and I'm not really looking at the photo reference too closely. I know there's some trees back there, so I'm going to add some shapes. All right, let's make one more. We'll make this one a little bit different. It's a little bit more of a, maybe a fuller bodied tree. in there. Make it feel a little darker in some areas. Some of these white specks I can fill in too. Too strong. You can see that streak that I just made, and that's a little better, but maybe not strong enough. So a little bit more of the ultramarine in with our burnt umber. All right, let's give this a shot. So I'm just going to let the brush kind of go around here. Yeah, maybe we'll pull it out just a little bit further. Okay, now that obviously isn't very strong at all. So while it's still wet, we'll grab a little bit more of the color, make it a little bit stronger. We'll pull it up onto the shrubbery here. This tape has been on here for several weeks. You know, the adhesive on the tape can tear your paper and pull it up if you're not careful. So I like to go very slowly and pull it at a complete 90-degree angle. So you can see there's a 90-degree angle. So I'm just going to pull out to the right instead of pulling up, and work slowly, like I said. And if you pull up, you're more likely to tear the paper, but if you're pulling against the grain, then that's less likely. And like I said, it just goes slowly there because it has been several weeks that we've been working on this. And last thing you want to do is tear that nice white edge and border.